This is House Planning Help, episode 108. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're into better building, whether new or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century. My personal goal is to create an energy-efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. Coming up in this session, my guest is Kirsty Maguire from Kirsty Maguire Architects, and we're going to be looking at progressing your house build plans before you have the land. What can you actually do, if anything? We're going to find out. Kirsty thinks she can help me. Before we move on, I wanted to talk actually, because we're approaching 2016, another year has just whizzed by, hasn't it? And I'm trying to get more strategic in terms of where the podcasts are going, and that will hopefully mean that I can just serve you better and do more overall and address more of your issues. I've got this business coach and she's helping me to sort out my life. It's just a mess in the background. We just about get there. I'd much rather be doing this efficiently. So that's the idea. And one element of that is to try and make sure that, firstly, the podcasts are planned up front, and secondly, that they're addressing things that you need addressed. Where are you stuck in the process of building a house or retrofitting a house at the moment? I'd love to help you out, and so we'll put a link in the bottom of the show notes just to tell me that simple answer. I'd like a bit of depth if possible. If not, no worries, just a simple point, and we'll see if we can address it. The majority of the times I get asked something, I try to sort it out. Sometimes we bring it onto the podcast. Sometimes I refer that person on to someone else who I feel can help them, and that normally works quite well. And then there are probably a handful of cases where those questions are still staring me in the face when I go and have a look at the planner and think, how can I answer this question? I really wouldn't even know where to start. Doesn't mean they've gone. It probably means that months have gone by, and the people that have submitted those questions think I've forgotten about them. I keep looking at those questions. So we do like your questions and to see exactly what it is that you'd like to know about. This podcast, I really try that every episode is different to the last. Of course, there are going to be common themes. What I'm talking about is that we try and keep things moving forwards rather than staying in the same position, so that we're learning, even if it is on a drip feed, just a little bit more each time. The one thing I will say is that the focus of these podcasts, it has to be relevant wherever you're listening in the world. We've got the hub that's very UK specific, so we'll want to build that out in other areas over time. For now, though, that's UK specific on new builds. So if you've got any of those queries, mortgages, planning permission, whatever it may be, we'll answer those in the hub. If it's something that might apply to others around the world, we don't mind going into depth in different countries a little bit. We just want to make it something that is not going to turn people away. Then get in touch. I'd like to know where you are in the process and how we can serve you better as you build your energy efficient home. Let's get to our featured interview. Kirsty Maguire from Kirsty Maguire Architects is someone that I've known for about 18 months now. I met her when we were doing some filming. Regen Media were producing some video inserts for the UK Passive House Awards, and I loved her project and was quite pleased as well to see that it went on to win. I think she's talented. She also feels she can help me with this odd feeling that I should be doing more on my house build, even though I haven't got land, and you know that I'm not going to go into that again, that I'm struggling to get land a little bit. What could I be doing that I'm not doing? Hopefully, Kirsty can answer me that today. So I started, as I often do, by asking Kirsty to tell me a little bit about her background.
So my name's Kirsty Maguire. I'm an architect based in Dundee in Scotland, and my practice works across the country and internationally. Most of my clients are private domestic, but I also work commercially and also with some charities and with United Nations, which is the main reason that I get to do quite a lot of travelling across to exciting parts of the world, such as Armenia and Georgia. But most of my projects are here in Scotland, from Ayrshire all the way up to Moray and everywhere in between. So one of my new projects is on the island of Ling, but it's also fantastic to have projects on the doorstep.
Are you working such a large area just because your services are in a niche, really?
I suppose that's likely to be the case. Because my work's quite specialist with the passive house and eco architecture, I suppose it gives me the opportunity to work all over the place. And there aren't that many architects in Scotland at the moment who specialise solely really in that and have the same kind of track record. So I often work with clients because of that. But I also have a lot of clients who I have worked with over a long period of time. And as they move a house or, for example, get a holiday home or a new business in a different place, then they often come back to me, which is fantastic. So I think it is because I'm quite specialist, yes.
Now, I'm really trying to get your services today to help me on something that I keep thinking. I'm looking for land at the moment. I've put in a couple of bids, but I've got nowhere. But I keep wondering, are there things that I should be doing in the meantime? I'm sure there are, because all that's going to happen is later down the line, once you have the land, once the architect's in place and so forth, then all of these decisions and things that I could have been thinking about, I'm going to have to make quite quickly, aren't I? So that's what I'm hoping today can be about. So where would we start?
Well, the first question that I would always ask is, what are you looking for from your project? And so are we talking specifically about housing here for your podcast?
Yes. Yeah, it's okay. Always about housing, but let's try and think about my own situation here. So it's going to be a fairly small house, probably 100 to 120 square meters is what we're aiming at. And that can be quite tricky for the land as well, because any small piece of land, everyone's going for it. Or if it's a slightly bigger bit of land, then people want to put 10 houses on or something. So we'd like a garden as well, some land around it. And we're searching in quite a clearly defined area, aware that if this keeps on going, being quite hard, that we might have to broaden out. So that's the starting point, really.
So it sounds like you've got great ideas and you're quite clear about what you would like from the house. And so what I would suggesting is to put you in a really strong position when you're bidding for any plot of land is to do a little bit of a feasibility study and develop your project brief. So what we can do is sit down together and look at what you would like from your home in a bit more detail, how you might like that to be designed in terms of both performance and style, and then start to talk about some of the more practical sides, such as budget and some of the things like what might be in terms of site constraints, things that might put you off a site that might otherwise look quite good, but also things that might mean that you can take on a trickier site that might put other people off, which would give you an edge if you're bidding. So the other things we'd look at might include planning restrictions in your particular area.
Well, let's go through some of those. You've asked me some questions. So what was the first one that you said?
So the first question I would always ask is what you're looking for from your new home, and to describe a little bit about your ideas and dare say some of your dreams for that for you and your family.
You're obviously putting me on the spot here. Would this be something that I would be on the spot, or I'd be expected to go away and come back to you with some answers?
I think most people that I work with have been thinking about building a house for a long time. So they've already got quite a strong feel for the type of house that they like. Maybe not solutions and design, but an idea of atmosphere, how they'd like to use their house, what kind of relationship with the landscape. Things like you talk about, you'd like to have a garden. You know, if they've got children, for example, then looking at how they would use the house as they're small, as they grow, and then also as they leave home, and home is then an empty nest, as it were. Or it might be that designing a house for people as they're downsizing and looking to reduce energy bills and increase comfort, and perhaps it's a retirement home for them. Okay,
well, I've got a few details that we can fill in. First of all, clearly this podcast, I've been working out that I do want to live in a passive house. That's a big, right at the top target. Mm-hmm. Also, I have a young family at the moment. I've got a 1-year-old. Perhaps we'll have another child in the next couple of years, hopefully, fingers crossed. So this will be a family home that I'd hope to stay in for 10 years or so. In terms of atmosphere, I think we'd like it to be fairly open plan, but to have some rooms that we could retreat to. A lot of my work takes place at home, or else I'm out traveling, so it'll just be with a computer that I can plug in if I'm staying at a hotel or so forth. So it's important that my wife and I both have a place to work in the home that's perhaps, the far reaches of the house, if that's at all possible. I would like a lot of natural light. I don't know whether these sorts of things does everyone say that, or is this all different? I'd like the house to centre around the kitchen, because that's very much a place that I enjoy being, and the houses that I like all seem to do well, have all conversation and so forth in the kitchen. How's that? Any good?
That sounds great. And what you said, it's not unusual as a brief. And I think what becomes very interesting working on a bespoke project is developing that conversation, and then really understanding how you and your family work now in terms of your workspace and how you envisage family space. So you talked about the kitchen being the heart of the home, and that's great. And again, that's not unusual, but as we start to explore some of those things as part of a briefing process, that would really start to get into the detail of what makes you guys tick.
Well, come on then. Let's do it. Let's go a little bit further along. What more would you like to ask me then?
I guess this is where usually I would start to sketch things out with you and
damn.
chat about things and really enjoy that part of the process, because that's where we can all get excited about things and it becomes a dialogue rather than me asking questions and you giving me answers.
Should I have come to you with, say, a scrapbook of things that I like the look of, or is that just a waste of space? There's another thing that I suppose I should throw in here, that my wife is very keen on straw buildings. And from the passive house point of view, I'm less keen. I know there are ways of doing it. I've been to a few straw bale houses and absolutely love them, particularly the atmosphere inside. The acoustic is very, very special in those buildings, but from a performance point of view. So is that something I should throw in, or are you then saying, oh no, you're trying to go down that particular route?
No, I think it's great to have a scrapbook, because an image really does paint 1,000 words here, and it allows us to start to have a discussion about some of the less tangible elements of designing a home, and in your case, a workspace. So you're talking there about acoustics and atmosphere. And for me at this stage, then, if we can get into some of those less tangible elements to talk about what makes something feel really like a home for you, rather than talk about solutions of this room wants to be 20 meters squared or things like that, which can be helpful and form part of the overall discussion. So a scrapbook is great. And I often ask people to bring that along to a meeting. It's not essential, but it certainly helps. And things like straw buildings are interesting. I haven't designed one, although I've been quite interested in looking at them. So that would be an exploration for us all if you wanted to go down that route. But one thing about acoustics that's interesting that you mention that is that the feedback that I've had from people in passive house or close to passive house homes is how quiet it is inside them. And they've really enjoyed that.
It is special, the whole environment, which I think sells itself. We've heard that enough in the podcast. Okay, so I'm forming a little bit of a brief here. I've given you a few ideas. What's next?
Well, part of that briefing process, it takes a while. It takes a while to get to know a client. You've already given me enough that I would be able to go in and start coming up with some ideas if you wanted me to. And then those ideas would also then start to form or develop that brief. So it's an ongoing conversation that happens throughout the process. And I would also ask you perhaps a little bit about your ethos towards eco-materials as well as passive house and energy and comfort, which we're taking as a given here. So you've mentioned straw building, but it sounds like you're not quite so sure about that.
Well, I love it. I'm just not so sure of the longevity of the straw bale buildings. I don't know. No, I am very with it. I suppose this is another question that I have for you. What if my wife and I have quite different ideas of what we want? It's bizarre that when I started all this 3 years ago, we probably had very similar ideas. We liked older buildings. And as I've learnt more and got more interested, I could do anything now. I feel that I would quite happily go in any direction just because I think it would be fun and nice to explore. Yet I imagine we're going to end up with something, the key thing for me is the passive house bit and also the layout. And then the rest of it, I don't really mind so much about. So if it does end up going down the straw route, then I'm very happy with that.
Well, this is where it's great for me as the architect to have a conversation with both of you there so that I can understand what you're both looking for. And that might be different. Hopefully it's not too different. But actually what you said doesn't make me think that they're not complementary, because you're interested more in perhaps now the performance and the feel of the build, and perhaps she's got more of an idea about aesthetic. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay, so perfectly complementary. And what I find really interesting about a lot of housing work that I do is often we're starting with quite a vernacular influence. For example, the passive house that I've designed just in southern Perthshire, that started off with the client bringing the idea of a traditional bothy. So completely vernacular building in the landscape, little stone building, very, very simple. And that's informed the design of what is quite a modern build, but not shouting out, I'm modern, look at me, which some people love, some people don't like at all. So it's horses for courses, really. We don't need to, being a passive house, it informs how it looks, but there's still a lot of options. So this is where a scrapbook is helpful to me, and sitting and chatting to both of you to understand, if you like, the dynamic as well and how you both negotiate that.
Let's have a think about land for a second, because you mentioned that you would go and do a few sketches. Was that only after you get land or before land? And if so, what impact does having that plot of land actually have to what's going on?
Ideally, there would be a plot of land before we start sketching, but that's not always the case. And when we're doing sketches before there's land, I wouldn't tend to go into an awful lot of detail. It's more conceptual sketches looking at relationships of spaces in a home, and maybe atmosphere, feeling, because of course a very important part of designing a new home is how you approach it and its response to the landscape. So there's only so far that we can go with that without land. But often people come and speak to me when they're looking at a plot or maybe a few plots. And so we can look at how that might sit in the landscape there. And that might even be before they've put an offer in. It might be once an offer has been accepted and it's still in negotiation, or it may even be after they've bought the plot. But it's not unusual to be at very early stages before an offer's gone in.
Is it a case then of me saying, perhaps I'd like my kitchen to be next to the living room? Is that how I'd like to use the space? Or what details do I need to give you about how I'm going to live in this house?
Well, it's really looking at, you talked about having your workspace not detached from the home physically necessarily, but not in the heart of the space, things like that.
I've thought of another one, because at the moment we're in this terraced house where the stairs are the squeakiest stairs ever. So one thing that we'd really like to get away from is having noisy area right outside my son's bedroom, or the children's bedrooms as it will be in the future. Would that be useful?
Yes, things like that are useful. And it's always interesting to understand what kind of home you're in at the moment, and therefore how that's informing your reactions to your new house.
What about little details? For example, my wife said yesterday, in our new house, we really need a heated towel rail. And I thought to myself, well, in a passive house, would you actually need that? Is that detail just totally irrelevant to the new house because it will be at the end? Or should I start thinking about what type of bathroom I want and go through catalogues? You
don't need to be specifying what tiles or towel rail you have at this stage, but it's always handy to get those kind of questions up right now and chat about, actually, are you going to have damp towels all the time because you're not going to put your towel rail on? No, that's not the case. You can put your towel rail on and have nice dry towels and a cosy bathroom. And those are the kind of things that people do find a little bit, not worrying, but nice to understand what it's going to feel like on a day-to-day basis to live in their new home.
Just moving it along our feasibility study, I know that you were keen to get into budget as well before we design 1,000 square metre home or something crazy castle.
Yeah, so it's always useful to talk about that right at the start. I don't know whether all architects do that or not. I hope so. And I'm not a cost expert, but we can look at other projects that we've done and get an idea roughly of what might be feasible. Because if you have only got 100,000 to spend on a house, but you want to build a 350 square metre home, then it's better to know that at the start so that we're not all wasting our time and emotional effort in the project. But it's more about trying to bring those two together, see what's feasible and what you can and can't do. What we often do as part of the sort of feasibility options appraisal, particularly when there is a site already and we can do some initial sketches, is then work with a quantity surveyor to give costs, even at that very early stage. So there might be 2 or 3 options, and based on the budget that you provide for us, and they can go through either at pounds per square metre cost or in more detail, depending on what you'd like, and then sit down together to talk through that. And that helps people to prioritise what they'd like to do, assess whether they want to do it, because sometimes people choose not to at this stage, and that's a valid thing as well.
Something else I'd like to throw in here, say for example my budget I'm hoping will be around about 500,000 to 600,000, somewhere everything all in. The trouble is with land where we are, it's very expensive. The last bid we put in was 240,000, the plot went for 400,000.
Wow.
Which is crazy. So what happens most of the time, I'm assuming, is the plot is a lot less than the actual build cost, or is that wrong, or does it change all the time?
I guess it depends where you are. It sounds like plots are a lot more expensive where you are than around here. Again, it will vary depending where you are, even locally. But yeah, typically I would say the plot is less than the build cost here, if we're talking to 100 to 150,000 for a plot.
Okay. So that sorts out some budgetary. I imagine there's not much more we can talk through, or can you ask me any other questions? You know roughly the figure that I'm going for. Is there anything else you'd like for your progressing the plans?
For a feasibility study, what we do is look at your budget, what you have for a construction cost, what you might need to set aside for fees and expenses and for the plot, and also suggest that you get an idea of costs of bringing services onto the site, because that can be very expensive. You can then break that down and look at what you might then have for your house itself for the build, and apply a pounds per square metre rate for that, which would look at what was appropriate locally. But let's, for the sake of argument, say it was £2,000 per square metre, and you've got £200,000 for your build, then if we can fit everything you need into your 100 square metre house, then that's great. But if you actually need double that in terms of area, then we need to start to look at how that might be achieved or not.
I'd like to cover an example in a few moments of just one of your clients, and this is a project that I've actually wanted to talk to you about for some time, and I know that quite a nice client input as well, so it's going to work well. Is there anything else, I haven't stopped you short, that on your feasibility study, or are those the main things?
I think the main things are design ideas, what you'd like, and breaking down the budget to see if those are achievable. The other elements are planning, which are quite site specific, so perhaps not something to discuss in detail right now. Any other specifics, conservation area is something that we'd look at, access, and any special requirements that you have.
So what's the access one?
So access, if you might have a great plot, but it's very difficult to get cars onto the site.
So that's only going to happen when we have land, in other words?
Yeah,
or are we
yeah.
saying that actually we want 3 cars on this, so that's going to influence what plot we buy?
It certainly would, yeah, because if you don't have physical space for it, and some planning requirements or planning policies, you have to have a certain percentage of your ground as garden. So if you know that 60% of your ground has to be garden, you've got a house of a certain size, you need parking and access, then that starts to dictate the size of plot that you need.
let's talk about Duncan and your award-winning project. The Hayshed will incorporate the video from the Passive House Trust Awards 2014. Is that right? Or was it the year before?
That is right. Yes, last year.
Congratulations again.
Thank you very much.
Can you explain how this developed? We're particularly interested in those very early days.
So the client came to us quite some time ago. It was when I was working for another practice, and he was is a very knowledgeable client. He already had actually outline planning on the site, but he was very interested in low energy and passive house buildings. He interviewed a number of architects, I don't know who else, but he decided to work with us, and he had really strong vision and artistic as well. So strong ideas about what you'd like to see on the site. And we used the vernacular Hayshed, so back to the idea of using traditional buildings in the landscape to influence modern design, where he came to us with that idea, and we used that to develop the overall project. Now, interestingly, that allowed us to work quite closely with the planners, in fact, because their planning policies at the time were for very traditional pseudo-vernacular buildings, which this isn't. Although the story for the design of this is that it's on the edge of a farm building cluster, and rather than create a pseudo second farmhouse that looked like an old building, we decided to expand the cluster in a more vernacular way, which was to add a building which looked much more like the traditional haysheds.
And from a passive house point of view, you didn't go, uh-oh, this is going to be difficult.
No. We thought this is going to be challenging because it was one of the first passive house buildings in Scotland.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So that doesn't help. And then you've got to somehow make this dream float.
Yes. And to be honest, I found it more exciting than anything else. And I think that was something that took us all the way through the project, was Duncan's enthusiasm, my enthusiasm, and also that of the contractor once they came on board, and everyone else who was involved in the project.
And it was interesting for this one that Duncan, in many ways, had more knowledge than some of the local builders, really, didn't he?
He did, yes. He went and researched Passive House significantly, and he and I developed that knowledge together as well in terms of the design process. And so he was able to work with the local contractors as part of that. And he's a building contractor himself, so also extremely knowledgeable in that area, which was great. So it was very much a collaborative project.
Ah, I didn't know that, because he's also, is he a farmer? I'm now starting to wonder whether he is.
He is a farmer, and like most farmers, he's diversified into different areas.
Okay, all right. Let's just quickly talk a bit about the construction of this. I know that that's not strictly on topic for today, but since we'll be showing a few pictures in the show notes. So how did you address all of this, and what were some of the key challenges of the build?
I think one of the great things that we have in Scotland is the timber frame construction tradition. So that allowed us to use an I-beam structure with glulam timber for the roof to get the curve. And that meant that we had great joiners on site who actually were able, because we had space, they were able to build the frame on site as a balloon frame and then crane it into position. So that has some challenges in itself, particularly on such an exposed site as this, but it allowed them to have complete control over the detailing and quality on site. So it means that the erection of the house, once it's been created in panels, is actually very quick. So that was then stuffed with superglass insulation, which is made in Stirling, which is relatively local as well. And it was all clad in zinc. Everything, including the rainwater goods, match with the VM zinc system.
What's the orientation of this one? Am I right in saying that it almost looks a bit out west?
It does, yes. So the views are stunning. The views are out over Arran and Ailsa Craig in the sea, over the west coast, over the rolling farmland. So in fact, last time I was there, we were looking out from the dining room and there was a fox trotting across the field outside as well. So there's no way we weren't going to make use of those views. So we did twist the building round to orientate it in that direction.
And in terms of overheating, how did you address that to make sure that it wasn't going to get really hot? I know the sun sometimes doesn't shine for a few days in a row, or isn't it 1,000 different weathers that you get in a single day?
Something along those lines, yes. So there's always a breeze there because it's so exposed. So that helps with cooling. And we modelled it in PHPP right from the start. And that, of course, influenced us in terms of window sizes. We've got a small amount of shading on the large glazed panel, and they simply open the door slightly to get some ventilation. Duncan said that they're very pleased with it in terms of its stability of temperature.
Excellent. And what did you learn overall from the whole project? You mentioned that this was when you were working with another practice. So it was off the back of this, really, you launched your own practice.
Partly, yes, because we gained planning for the house when I was working elsewhere. And then Duncan took a couple of years out from the project to sell his old house and various other things. And in the meantime, I'd set up on my own, and he came back to me and we worked from building warrant onwards together. I think one of the main things that we learned was how positive the whole team can be when we worked together and when everyone's really excited about the outcome of something that is really inspiring to them all. Everyone was great. The guys who did the services with the MVHR and the heat pump, we all sat down together in a room and looked at how we could integrate the two to make them as efficient as possible, for example. And people were just, because this was something relatively new, the people that we chose to work with were not the type who were going to suck their teeth and say it can't be done, of course. So it was very much a can-do approach. There was lots of challenges on the project because it was something new, but equally with the people that we had as part of the team, none of them were insurmountable. And it was more about how do we go to the next stage and how do we do that the best way possible.
Well, I think that's a good point to wrap things up. Is there a final thought that you'd like to reflect on, perhaps not to do with your Hayshed creation, award-winning, but just on our feasibility study that we based most of the episode around?
In terms of the feasibility study, I think it's great to do that, whether you have a plot or not. I think it sets out the basis of the entire project so that people can really enjoy the design stage, knowing that some of the absolutely critical elements, such as budget planning, and some of the, if you like, drier sides of it, but essential to the success of a project, are in place and are addressed right from the start. So it creates a great foundation for everything from there on in.
Yeah, you've made me realise that I'm going in and attempting to buy land without actually having a good budget plan. So you're right, I need to do some of that legwork. That'll be a future podcast, I'm sure, coming up. Kirsty, thank you very much for your time.
A pleasure. Great to speak to you. Thanks, Ben.
Head online to take a look at today's show notes. You'll find them at houseplanninghelp.com/108. You can review the key points. We've got photos of the Hayshed project that we've talked about, and you can see the video that was made for the UK Passive House Awards. And if you'd like to, you can comment or leave a question at the bottom of the show notes. Links to Kirsty, and they're all at houseplanninghelp.com/108. Let's give you a quick update on the hub before we close for today. And in the pipeline at the moment, we've got a couple of things as we get towards the end of this month. We've got our third episode of the Long Barrow case study, which we're going to release soon. That talks about the foundations and blinding layers and insulation underneath the building after we've got this huge, great hole. The other thing, I think heave was a big issue on the Long Barrow project because that hole was so big. We discussed that in the video, and there's also some information to read around that. So that's coming soon, as is our module on planning permission that we've been working on, and we're getting closer now. So I'll let you know as that's released. You can check out our free course in the meantime on finding land. That will just give you an idea of what we're trying to do on a regular basis, how it will work, how we're trying to lay it out to simplify the information as much as we can without taking it down to silly level. So houseplanninghelp.com/hub. We'd love you to sign up and be a member. That's it. Thank you. I'll be back again soon. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.